All right. Well, again, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar on harnessing neurodivergence in university students with Abby Osborne. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. The chat box is open, so please feel free to share your thoughts, ideas, and experience with others in the room. But we also have the Q&A feature open for questions, and if you have any, please add them here to answer in the Q&A session with Abby after her presentation. So again, today's webinar is being recorded and we'll send out the recording to all registrants a couple days after the webinar, along with some additional resources. So we'll go ahead and get started, really. Again, welcome everyone to today's webinar on harnessing neurodivergence in university students. Some initial introductions. Today with us to share her expertise is Abby Osborne. Abby works at the University of Bath in the Center of Learning and Teaching as their curriculum and academic development lead. She has extensive experience mentoring and tutoring students from secondary to higher education. And she also works as a consultant to support busy teachers to develop their inclusive practices. So through her work with students and teachers, Abby has developed many practical strategies to overcoming multiple barriers to learning, which we all face. And a little bit about Abby's connection to SAGE. She comes to us through her work with SAGE Skills Student Success and a few SAGE books, all dedicated to supporting student skills and well-being throughout the college and university experience. So SAGE Skills Student Success is a new kind of digital resource that helps university students build critical skills for academic and personal success. Just this past February, the new Harnessing Neurodivergence Skill Unit by Abby was added. And as an editor and author for this unit, Abby provides a space where learners can reflect and think differently about how they learn best and offers a range of practical study strategies that they can personalize for their needs. Abby has also recently published 2 books on inclusive teaching and learning and worked with teachers across the globe covering the educational journey from primary to postgraduate study. So that's enough for me, and I will turn it over to Abby.
Hi all, thank you for that lovely introduction, Diana. It's really nice to be here with so many of you here today. I'm just going to start quickly by trying to share my slides. Bear with me for a moment. There we go. Hopefully that's all right and everybody can see my slides displaying correctly. Is that all good? Lovely. So as I say, great to be here. My name is Abby, and just to give you a little bit of background really in terms of why I'm here. Obviously I've had the opportunity to write this skill for SAGE and been on a kind of journey as an author with SAGE as well and published these 2 books. And I was just thinking about my own journey in a sense in higher education and in education more generally, and how it's been quite a strange trajectory to get to this point, but one that's been really significant for me and really exciting and given me perhaps a kind of quite a unique perspective. And I started this journey many years ago supporting students who are neurodivergent in higher education, but also in further education and in secondary schools. And it was a really amazing experience for me, and it really kind of helped me to change a lot of my own assumptions, but also those societal assumptions about how we can best support students and remove barriers to learning. So although I work currently at the University of Bath and my focus is very much on assessment and feedback at the moment, inclusive teaching and learning is my passion. And I think I come at that from 2 angles, and that is one in terms of kind of my own journey of moving from a support capacity where I've worked with students individually to this idea of embedding strategies at the point of design and now supporting teachers internationally to develop inclusive teaching practices. But also, and something I'll cover with you today as well, is this idea of, as well as us kind of adapting our approach to teaching at the point of design, we can actually much better equip our students with a toolkit to, in a sense, differentiate their own learning experience. And these kind of 2 approaches that align really nicely as a kind of sustainable approach for inclusive support, and one that, as I say, enables us to really harness neurodivergence within our university communities. Obviously quite a large audience today, but please do go ahead, use the chat. We welcome questions, more than happy to have discussions. We've got a few polls as well that we've added in to try and kind of get your input where possible. So although it's quite large and formal in that sense, please do feel happy to and able to contribute and I say ask questions. So just want to start off with this idea, in a sense. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of the narrative around support and SEN provision and individual labels and how that works currently, particularly in higher education, but across the system. But I think it's just worth bringing attention to. I recently did a session with a group of schools in secondary schools in London, and just a couple of really interesting quotes and discussion ensued there around this idea that more and more children are being diagnosed, particularly post-pandemic, and we're seeing a lot this real emergence of, a lot of students emerging with challenges to do with their mental health. And in a sense, this recognition that the current system, although it's really important and a vital lifeline, students have to jump through a lot of hoops to access much needed support. And often there's a developmental price and a timing price, particularly if that doesn't happen. For many students we work with in higher education, the ones that we see that have a diagnosed support needs in a way are kind of the lucky ones. They're the ones that have overcome those barriers to actually accessing support in the first place. So I feel there's appetite there as a society, and this is globally at the moment, to kind of talk about a need for a paradigm shift. And in a sense, that's nothing new. We do that quite a lot in education. We're good at reflecting, and we always want to make improvements. But I was hoping today to kind of give some quite practical suggestions and approaches in terms of how that might be possible, and to almost manage that disconnect in a sense between kind of policy and that high level, those principles around inclusive practice and how we should manage that, and the reality on the ground for really busy teachers, really busy practitioners. So that's kind of the direction of travel I'd like to take with you guys today. I want to just start with this is a quote that certainly in the UK has become, it's a definition of inclusivity, and it's become quite a dominant definition in the higher education sector. Don't worry too much about reading the whole thing. I just want to bring your attention to a couple of individual specific words here, and those words happen to be this idea of individual and individual difference. So this definition of inclusivity from Hocking celebrates this idea that we start with individual difference, and we use that as a source of diversity, and we can use that to enrich the learning experience. Now, I'm not challenging that morally. I think actually that is at the heart of what most of us would want in teaching and learning, and that's what's wonderful about education, and we should celebrate individual difference. But that can be quite problematic and hard for teachers, particularly when we think about classes that are growing in size. You could have a lecture theatre with 300 students. That's not unusual, and there's that tension in terms of, right, I want to respond to individual difference, but how do I manage that? But at the moment, that's kind of where we're at. We've seen the emergence of a very strongly defined culture of labelling. Certainly in higher education, a student has to get a diagnosis and a label, and that's a really legitimate route through university, and it enables that student to access much needed support. So as I say, again, I'm not critiquing for a moment that really important lifeline, but in a sense, to what extent is that mechanism still viable when we realise that actually a lot of the stuff we're doing, we could be embedding at the point of design. So I just want to start by talking about the limitations of labels. And I've mentioned this idea of individual difference. And when we talk about neurodivergence, we tend to be referring to a range of conditions, which might include autistic spectrum conditions, things like dyslexia, ADHD. And in a sense, what we've got is a list of different individual definitions, and the support tends to be focused on those labels. Now, I just want to identify a couple of challenges. And one of the problems for higher education is that quite often those labels carry with them lots of stereotypes, and a lot of you will already kind of be aware of that. And sometimes we overlook the fact that when a student gets a diagnosis, that's often based on their childhood experience. So sometimes that diagnosis, although it's still relevant and has an impact on learning, the way that we talk about that diagnosis might have shifted and changed. So in a sense, we've got one tension there already, that when we take into account just that kind of snapshot of a label, it doesn't take into account that journey that the student has been on to get to that point. And it doesn't take into account those amazing compensatory strategies that that student has developed. And the other thing I just wanted to flag as well is this idea of what Collinson refers to as the shadow of dyslexia. And he talks about like a set of characteristics, largely sort of stereotypical. But, if we ask society at large, what do we mean when we talk about what does dyslexia mean? People will come up with a kind of standard definition. And what tends to happen is that we focus more on the shadow of the diagnosis or the label rather than the lived experience. And so we focus on the presentation of those difficulties. And that has a whole range of ramifications, in a sense, for teachers. It can make people have a really kind of superficial sense of what it must be like to have that particular diagnosis. And that's not always particularly, as I say, helpful in characterising the student, the lived experience. It can also cause challenges for really busy teachers who may feel fear associated with, and I've had this a lot over the years where people say, ADHD, I don't know anything about that. I'm not an expert in that. And we've kind of created a culture around SEN or special educational needs where, in a sense, it's regarded as a highly specialised professional domain. And that in itself is not a problem, and it's important to signpost. But that's come at a little bit of a cost, where I think a lot of teachers, as I say, grapple with this sense of, what does this mean in reality for teaching and learning? So we wanted to do a quick poll with you now. And in a sense, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. What I'd like to do is I'd like you to almost think about when you hear a term like autistic spectrum conditions, dyslexia, attention deficit, ADHD, something like that. What kind of terms, what stereotypical characteristics come to mind? And if we went out and did a poll in society and we asked people, what sort of things would they identify? And I'd just like to get a snapshot of, as a community here, of people teaching, supporting learning and learners themselves. What are those kind of impressions of stereotypes that we often associate with some of those terms? So if you'd be happy to back over to Diana for a moment for the poll.
Just popped up. We're getting 30, 40 responses and climbing.
Lovely. Actually, I've just realised I can't see the answers.
I think once I end it, it should pop up.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. It's
I'll
good
give
to
it
have
another
time
second.
there for this. Thank you.
Give it another few seconds. See a comment. I've heard people describe them as slow, unsocial.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to some of these. That's really useful. It's great. Yes, just whilst we're waiting, I've been doing quite a bit of work recently around this idea of slow learning. And in higher education, slow learning is a wonderful thing. It's what we need for critical thinking and problem solving.
So I can see the results. So I'll start reeling them off a little bit. Sometimes
Thank you.
difficulty understanding social norms and expectations.
Yeah.
They're misunderstood. They lack focus or hyper-focus, executive functioning, the social skill struggles, poor academic performance, quote unquote weird, unsocial, not attentive, quirky, different, outsider.
Yeah.
Differing education needs, lack of social awareness, different and creative ways of thinking.
Nice. Okay. Yeah.
Problematic behaviors, issues with attention, social cues, and understanding words on a page.
Yeah. There's so many there I could pick up on, and I'm just going to pick out a few key themes. And I think it's really interesting in a sense, like we talk about what's in a name and what comes with a label, but a number of you mentioned there this idea of kind of social engagement or social communication, the social aspect. And certainly with something like autistic spectrum conditions, I've worked with dozens of students over the years. And I think it's really important to note that, while some of those students may struggle with social interactions, or I've heard people say, oh, they're the students, or those are the individuals who struggle with language. And I think, just an anecdotal tale, I always remember working with one student who was trying to compose an email to his lecturer, and he was paralyzed by sort of analysis paralysis because he was thinking about every single word in every single phrase that he wrote. So in a sense, it's about repositioning our thinking around that label and not seeing and making an assumption that, oh, somebody struggles with social interaction or they're not very good at it, and actually thinking, no, sometimes somebody sees sees difficulty in communicating because they can see what a weak tool it is, in a sense, and they can see how problematic it is. And I think that's a really important distinction. Often with something like dyslexia, we'll hear terms such as, oh, they're ones that struggle with reading. And I always think it's really important to say, well, a student who struggled to learn to read at school, that's very different from a student reading to learn at university. And some of the students I've worked with, yes, they might find decoding text harder, but actually their comprehension has been absolutely brilliant, and those critical thinking skills have been really, really enhanced. So it's again that kind of shifting away from that label, that deficit. And in a sense, as I say, we're doing a bit of we're not doing justice to that group of students. The other classic, and a lot of you mentioned things like focus and lack of concentration. The classic one is, the little lad with ADHD, and the very term itself, the words there, attention deficit. And what I often find, even working with parents, is I'll try and say, look, try and take a step away from the label, and rather than thinking of it as a deficit in attention, think of it as an over-attending to everything. And so in a sense, what I'm trying to suggest here is a subtle but really powerful distinction where we, in a sense, a label, a name, or a shadow, as Collinson refers to, has inadvertently done quite a bit of harm in terms of that kind of public perception and persona. And that has trickled through into higher education. So I do a lot of work, as I say, in terms of repositioning those labels and getting people to go beyond that immediate presentation. So thank you, that's really useful. And it was nice to see there's some really kind of positive terms in there as well. And in a sense, we are seeing a sea change, and a lot more students are talking, a lot more people are talking about, their own barriers and challenges. And we're recognizing that we all have challenges, in life and in education as well. And so I think slowly, actually, there is appetite for change in that space, which is excellent. Okay, so I just want to, just check my slides moving on. Just want to move on to again sort of talk about this idea of individual difference. So we've got an academic, we've got people working in professional services doing their best, might be a little bit concerned about the sort of some of these labels and terms and feel that they're not equipped with the skill set to support the student. We might have individuals who feel that actually they don't fully know what that means beyond that kind of immediate label or that shadow. And we have another issue, and this is this idea of coming back to the sort of wonderful notion of individual difference, but actually the challenge in terms of the reality of doing this at scale. Now, I used to work one-to-one, so I had the wonderful opportunity to respond to individual difference, to work in a one-to-one capacity and learn from my students. And okay, that can be done as well, perhaps if you're working with a small group of students. But the problem is when you're suddenly faced with a large cohort. And in a sense, what therefore happens, and I have this conversation a lot with people in higher education, is this real kind of sense of letting students down, wanting to do your best for a student, but recognizing simultaneously that you've got a large cohort, it's growing in size each year. And there are lots of different potential needs and some conflicting needs in that cohort. And how do you manage that, and what's the best practice? So that's what I want to focus on in the sort of next part of this presentation with you. I also want to talk about this idea of neurodiversity and specifically neurodivergence. And as I mentioned, so neurodiversity refers to just the very fact that all our brains are different, we all think in different ways, we all assimilate, process and recall information differently, and how we kind of experience the world via our senses is also different. So neurodiversity just refers to that diversity in terms of how we all think and learn. And just in the same way that we're now recognizing that biodiversity is essential for the very functioning and survival of the planet, we're actually starting to recognize that neurodiversity is really, really important for the functioning of society. I can't underestimate enough. I'm not saying everyone with an autistic spectrum condition is a superhero, but I am making the point that a lot of the students I work with over the years have been some of the brightest and best students I've worked with, and they will be the ones in the future who will be problem solving really complex issues for society. So again, it's that positioning and thinking about almost going beyond the label and thinking about neurodiversity at large, but also students who are neurodivergent, and that refers to a whole range of conditions, as I say, such as dyslexia, ADHD, etc. So just in terms of sort of a framework then and some practical things that you can do, and how do you navigate that disconnect? How do you support your students in a way that's sustainable and not going to lead to burnout? And I just want to outline a model or a framework that I developed with a colleague of mine at the University of Bath. And we refer to this as our Patterns Beyond Labels model. And the idea is that central to it is that we recognise that for too long now we've separated out different groups of students who are at risk of being marginalised, and we've almost identified different lists of things we need to do in those spaces. So we might say, right, for this group of learners who are neurodivergent or dyslexia, or students with mental health, we have to do this, this and this. And what happens from the academic's point of view, or the teacher's point of view, is you've got a really complex list of things that you need to respond to. So we're trying to almost move away from this idea of either individual labels or individual groups with different challenges, to recognizing that the challenges we all face are actually universal. And this was what was most humbling. So when I was working with students, I just learned over a few years that in spite of their diagnosis, they had fear of the blank page, just like I did. They struggled with analysis paralysis or information overload. There was fear around presenting. There was concern around how do you structure and sequence your ideas when building narrative. And it just suddenly kind of dawned on me that we're fixating on these labels, and the point of, the diagnosis, and what we need to be doing is focusing on the impact of learning. So this colleague and I, in response to that work and feeling quite frustrated in a sense by it, was that we thought, right, we'll give colleagues a tool so that rather than responding to individual labels and needs, we obviously always need to do that too, but we can do much more that's anticipatory. And we can look across our whole cohort. And what I would do is I would urge you after this session actually to really think about your geographical, your cultural context, to think about your knowledge of your subject discipline, the area that you work in, the needs of the learners you work with, and not to underestimate how significant that knowledge base is. And with that, what you can do is you can identify patterns in need. You can identify patterns in challenge. And to help you to do that, we've got 3 key lenses that we tend to refer to. Now, the physical lens refers to where learning takes place, okay? And this tends to be the most dominant lens and tends to refer to access to a space. Now, one of the sort of more dominant ideas here is we might think immediately of access to a room, access via a lift or a ramp rather than stairs. So it's this idea of enabling students to access physical learning spaces. To an extent, this has also shifted a little bit to incorporate now digital spaces. So we think much more about accessibility in terms of font and images, etc., color contrast. So in a sense, we are starting to recognize that's not just a physical learning space, but a sort of digital learning space as well, where physical barriers can impact and undermine learning. So that's one lens. As I say, that tends to be one of the most dominant lenses at the moment. And that's the one that people tend to default to when they're thinking about inclusivity. They tend to think about accessibility, which is important, but we can go a step further. So the cultural lens refers to the what of learning. And I think about this in terms of the examples we use. Are they relevant to our cohort? So we might look at the demographic of our cohort. We might make sure that they recognize themselves in the examples or the reading activities or the learning activities we provide. Are our instructions explicit? We often think they are, but actually, if we take a step back and read them, I have a role where I look at lots of assignment briefs, and I have that benefit of being a step away. And quite often I can see, oh, there's issues or challenges in the way a brief is written, for example. So how much are we unpacking or making clear or transparent hidden curriculum for our students? And what assumptions are we doing about, what they should know? Doing lots of work around critical thinking, most common learning outcome, one of the most common learning outcomes in higher education. And yet actually we don't often unpack that with our students and aren't transparent about what does that look like on the ground. So that's the cultural lens, and that's the what of learning. And finally, and probably my bias and my background is the cognitive lens. And I feel that, whilst it's really important that we should design physical learning spaces, digital learning spaces that are accessible, and we should design learning activities that let all students participate, we can go a step further. Now, you could have a slide deck that was beautifully accessible in terms of your fonts, your color contrast, but if we've not thought about that cognitive lens and thought about how do our students process or assimilate or recall or synthesize knowledge, we can be overlooking lots of barriers. So that cognitive lens helps us to think about, how do we build narrative, for example, through a slide deck? Or do we put in pauses? How do we chunk content? How do we enable students to make the leap from one concept or idea to the next, and so forth? So this is like the nuts and bolts of what we do in higher education. And those three lenses together can be really empowering, because they can help us to think much more holistically about how the environment or the learning and teaching activities can impact and undermine teaching and learning. So I just wanted to share a few common barriers, and these are, again, things that I've identified in my time when people are asking me, well, okay, Abby, you might say don't fixate on the dyslexia diagnosis or this or that. What might you look at instead? And, I just recently, info overload, huge in higher education, partly because of the way we teach with a lecture format where lots of information is delivered in a short space of time, but also in terms of, things like Gen AI, access to countless sources of knowledge. And we tend to see choice and more knowledge as more empowering, but actually for a lot of students that can shut down that ability to process, that ability to learn slowly, which somebody mentioned earlier. So actually we can see real barriers around info overload. Mention things like hidden curriculum. Just wanted to mention sensory preferences, and I'm going to come back to that shortly. But this idea that we all make sense of our environment through our senses, and that's different for each of us. And just equipping ourselves with that knowledge of how an environment, we often think about physical access to a learning theatre, like a lecture theatre, for example, but we don't necessarily think about sensory access. I'm really affected by bright white lights. I get migraine, and I'm often in spaces where we're talking about inclusivity with no natural light and bright white lights. So if anyone in the audience has issues with light, just shout out to you, because these are things that we're not talking about enough. And obviously you can't meet everyone's sensory preferences all the time, but having a sense that these things can impact on people, I think, is really powerful. So as I said before, draw on your own localized knowledge of your discipline, the area that you're supporting students in, and the cohort in terms of your, expertise of spending that time with them, and thinking about them as a cohort. What are those barriers? What are those things that can impact on all aspects of learning? And then you can start to almost pick two or three of those that are most prominent or most problematic for your students. And it's not a case of solving this overnight, but doing that slowly over time. Okay, so I just want to kind of reiterate, in a sense, that point that hopefully you can draw on the lenses. Like I say, I wanted this session to provide people with some practical tools, some frameworks for thinking, and in a way, using those lenses can help us to ensure that we think about access, participation, and also progress. And I think that's really fundamental. So we're thinking about that physical, that cultural, and that cognitive lens. So I just want to move on to something slightly different now. So, okay, let's imagine the scene in the sense that you've looked across your cohort, you've identified some key barriers, and they affect the entire cohort. You might now want to think about what can I actually do to remove some of those barriers. And again, another tool that I worked on with a colleague at the University of Bath is we wanted to recognise, in a sense, that we needed to give staff some choice in terms of how they can manage those barriers. And it's not that there's just kind of one call to action or one thing that you can do, but that you can use a range of approaches. So I want to introduce you to the 3 Rs, and this works quite nicely in conjunction with the patterns beyond labels models. And the idea is that you think of a barrier to learning, and then you can reflect on the different ways that you can remove that barrier. And there are different options there. So the first thing we can do is we can, as I say, remove the barrier. So I'm just trying to think of an example that I can give you. If we take something around, there's a lot of discussion at the moment in the higher education sector around presenting and barriers. And we know that, there's high profile cases like the Aberhart case, but also there's a real kind of sense that a lot of us, it's fundamental. A lot of people are really frightened of presenting. And even those of us that do it a lot, you can still experience that fear. So we might say, well, actually, okay, rather than worrying about individual diagnoses, that is a challenge for my cohort. And so you could think about, right, remove would enable you to think about, well, is presenting one of your learning outcomes? Is that a necessary part of your assessment? And sometimes that will be, but sometimes you'll be able to build in choice, or you might actually think, no, on this occasion, I need to test their critical thinking, but actually their ability to convey information and engage an audience is not part of that. But remove gives staff that choice in terms of thinking about whether we could actually remove that barrier. Now, I think one of the things that I feel, and this is kind of anecdotal and my personal experience, is that whilst I think we should do as much as possible to remove barriers and unnecessary barriers to learning, we could also argue that it would not be doing our students justice if we say removed presenting entirely from our assessment portfolio. I've worked with a number of students who have had real, and I mean terrible, anxiety around presenting, linked to things like fainting, being sick. And I think there will always be a case where we can say an alternative assessment is needed. But the reduce function gives us the opportunity to say, well, look, okay, hang on a minute. We recognise this as a challenge, but actually what we can also do is we can reduce that barrier. So I don't mind sharing a really nice example. My son at an institution, another higher education institution he's at in the UK, they have a really nice option where you can record your presentation. So you can do it to a smaller audience, you could do it one-to-one, or you can pre-record. And so in a sense, the student's still practicing all those skills and developing themselves, but it's just reducing those barriers. So that's the reduce option. Now, the rethink, and I'm going to come on to this a little bit more, where I'm going to give you some practical strategies that, again, you might want to explore further and share with students yourself, or even share with family members, or I use these myself as well, so you might want to think about that. But rethink is also that kind of, okay, can I take a step back from this barrier, and can I think differently about it? So I've been doing quite a bit of work at the moment in Bath, at Bath Uni, about we're just starting to think about, right, well, we can build in some choice to presenting as an assessment type. We can enable students to pre-record, etc. But what we could also do is we could go a step further. We could give students the key or the tools to manage anxiety around presenting. And so that might in some ways look like, repositioning how students view presenting. Presenting is often equated with perfectionism. It's seen as something you've got to get absolutely right. You can't miss something, you can't forget something, you can't make a mistake. And actually you can still do a really authentic presentation and there could be errors. So it's kind of repositioning for students so there's not that terrible fear factor associated with it. The other thing we might do is we might think, well, okay, let's actually recognize if this is a common fear, not just for our students, but for all of us, let's share strategies. Let's have a community of learners where we're saying things like, okay, have you thought about whether you want to stand or sit, or do you want to move around when you're presenting? Moving can aid cognition, moving can help manage to anxiety. Would you feel better if the lights were dimmed slightly? Would you feel better if you had a big screen behind you with lots of images and slides so you can remove that attention from yourself? So what the rethink does is it actually enables us to rethink this whole idea of barriers to learning. And it means we can kind of have a double whammy of removing and reducing those barriers on the one hand through teaching design and teaching delivery, but actually rethink we can actually start giving our students some of those skills as well. So just to kind of reiterate that point, really, what I want to move on to now is we often talk about or hear about things like differentiation in the curriculum, or more recently, adaptive teaching has become huge. And what I'd like to do for this the last part of the session, and get your involvement with this as well, is to really think about this idea of, rather than adaptive teaching or differentiation, I'm gonna coin, I don't know if this is a term or not, but I'm gonna coin it if not, but this idea of adaptive learning, and this idea that actually, if there are universal hurdles and barriers to learning, let's start equipping our students with really flexible toolkits. And the beauty of these tools is that, and this is what I guess my biggest takeaway is for you guys today, and my own takeaway in my own work, was that the skill set that I could use with students who were so-called, who had a label or a diagnosis, or were neurodivergent, or were marginalized in some way, or at risk of being marginalized, actually those strategies and those tools work for all learners. And they don't just work in the learning context, they work in your home environment, they work in your work environment. So I often joke and say to people, I banged out my master's thesis in a third of the time, not because I'm older and wiser, but because I learned skills from strategies from students that nobody had ever taught me before. Nobody had ever given me access to these ideas. And I was able to kind of really adapt and build a flexible way of learning that really was much more efficient. So as I say, it kind of takes away from that idea of what we can do at the point of design, but we can actually also at the point of learning design help our students to navigate the messiness of learning by equipping them with tools, strategies, and skill sets that will last them for life, actually, and support lots of healthy lifelong learning habits. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the session, just for 10 or so minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A, is I just want to go through 2 or 3 key approaches that I've been using with students, probably for over a decade now, but I'm very grateful for Sage because we've been able to pull some of these strategies to the forefront, both in the books that I've produced with colleagues, but also in the skill that we've produced recently for Sage Resources as well. So the first thing I want to do is to just talk briefly about this idea of cognitively comfy learning. And some people say to me, well, that's a really strange phrase because I don't really ever think of cognition as being comfy. And they're right, actually learning is messy, it can be quite chaotic, it can be quite painful and at times and undermine our confidence. But we do have more control over it than we think. And so what I wanted to do is kind of get us and rethink this idea of how we should learn. Now, I was brought up at a time where there was a really idealized set of kind of key characteristics that you should have in your environment. So I don't know if anyone of similar age or similar experience, but you should work in silence, you should work at a clear desk, which is really organized, you should have really bright lighting, you should be sat upright, and there's lots of stuff about our kind of physical comfort. Now, I don't want everyone to suddenly develop a bad back in 6 months' time. So I should caveat this with saying that actually physical comfort is really important too, but we're missing a trick. And the idea is that actually we all respond differently to our environment. And the more we harness that environment and how we interact with that environment via our senses, the better equipped we are to manage our cognitive comfort. So we can actively use our environment and our senses to boost our cognition, to boost motivation, to harness focus and concentration. And it's a really kind of underrated and under the radar thing, and it doesn't cost anything. It's not about big high-tech changes. it's about saying to students, you know, what makes you comfy? What makes you comfortable for learning? And if I could tell you the one takeaway from working with hundreds of students who are neurodivergent, and it was most of them, probably 99% would say, oh my gosh, no one's asked me that, or I've not thought about that before. And actually, I'm really affected by my senses. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm actually going to get you all to think about how you're affected by your senses. And you might want to think about family members. And I just want to share my own experience that I was that neat and tidy little girl at school who had neat and tidy handwriting and sat at a desk and did all those things and never caused any trouble. But my efficiency at learning has really improved since I've changed the way I've worked. And that's been, you know, I'm quite open about this. If I've got a report to write, I can be found with a really heavy blanket. I can be tucked up, sometimes even in bed, listening to really loud music. And those are not the traditional, you know, yeah, that's not a situation you would think was conducive for learning. But for me, it's really powerful. And I never would have realized that or thought about it. It was only working with students who are neurodivergent I started to think, hang on, I can harness this myself. So if you haven't, I would urge you to harness it and think about what your cognitively comfy learning environment looks like. And just before we do that, I just want to introduce 3 terms, and that's move, manage, and micromanage. And let's say this is the idea that say you realized, okay, I'm somebody that prefers to, my thinking is better when I'm moving around. You know, you might have noticed your thinking is better when you're on a jog or walking or driving, or you might have a stand-up desk or something. And so move is for all of us as a reminder to go to an environment that works for you. And that's where possible, obviously. And that means move to a library, great if it works. Move to another room, move to a busy cafe, move to outside in the garden, move to an environment that boosts your cognitive cognition, your cognitive comfort. Manage enables us to think about, okay, if we're in a learning environment with others, and teachers often say this to me, that's all very well, but how do you manage 30 pupils with different needs? So manage might be where we might say to learners in a class, right, we can't have you all running around and doing your own thing, but we can build in pauses where we'll get up and we'll all move. And lots of primary schools do that now, where they'll all move around, get up, walk in between activities. And micromanage, the final one here, is this idea of what do you do where you're in an environment where you can't disrupt, you can't move, you can't do the thing you want. And what I love about micromanage is it lets us mimic the behavior from move and manage, but in a way that's really under the radar and unnoticeable. So that might be in terms of I had a student once who had some sequins on her pencil case and she was able to rub them backwards and forwards. And so that simple movement was enough to aid her cognition. So that's how you can, as I say, think about how you're affected by your environment and then how you can harness that via move, manage, and micromanage. So I'd just like to open that up to everyone and just say, what are your cognitively comfy strategies? And if people be happy to share anything you've tried. And I think for me, I think, you know, the more creative, the better. It's about creating a kind of shared experience here.
I've launched the poll, so we'll leave it open for a minute or two to give everyone a chance to answer. And when I end it, I'll share my poll screen. I believe you were able to see it. Some responses for the last poll, Abby.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. For some reason, I don't know if it's just because I'm sharing my screen, but I can't see them. But yes, if you could share some, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
37 and climbing. I don't mind sharing my own personal comfy learning strategy actually that I realized after speaking
Brilliant.
with you, Abby, but that's I enjoy or I work and learn best when I have headphones on.
Yeah.
Something about the weight and the cushion helps me focus.
Brilliant. Yes, you're right. Most people might just think of headphones for noise cancelling or music, but actually it's the physical sensation of that. It's really, really grounding. A lot of us had chance during the pandemic to think about these things in ways we perhaps hadn't before. But in a sense, it's sad that we've lost that. A lot of us have kind of returned to work in ways that are normal, you know, and we've lost some of that nuance, I think.
Give it another 30 seconds. We've almost reached 50% of people in the room. participating. We have a couple of responses, taking regular breaks, fiddling with and twisting paper clips, pulling a blanket over my head to create a sort of tunnel vision, podcasts, curled up with a hot drink, music, false deadlines.
I like that.
Using Play-Doh to shape and hold while listening, working in a
Nice, yeah.
quiet and isolated place, non-lyrical music, having news on the background, a quiet environment, listening to Bob Marley.
I like it. I recommend that for everyone. Brilliant. So again, loads of lovely suggestions there. And in a sense, what I'm realizing myself and my colleague, particularly kind of passionate about this, is whenever we talk to people, we add to our toolkit in terms of what cognitively comfy learning can look like. And I think the main thing is for all of you, it's part of this is a nicety, like you might enjoy a particular thing in your environment, but actually it's going a step further. It's recognizing that where we can actually adapt and tweak our environment to really harness our environment to boost cognition. So something like you said there, a couple of nice examples, we could say silence or music, but actually we could say all the things in between, different types of noise, white noise, brown noise. It might be a certain type of music you're listening to. It might be the volume. So again, playing around with all those things can actually enable us to kind of layer and combine different strategies, which can be really, really empowering. So thank you. That's brilliant. That's really helpful. So just last couple of things I want to mention before just opening up for some for Q&A. I just want to mention this other idea that again sometimes passes us by, but I found this has been really beneficial. So just as our physical environment affects our ability to kind of process information, our writing environment, the environment where we capture ideas, that space on a page, whether it be digital or printed, can really also affect our cognition. And quite often I'll ask students, have you ever thought about this? And it's interesting that we're not really taught this at school. So we tend to default to particular ways of working, like the mind map is the most popular. Or some of us might have a particular method, i.e. like we like working on the computer. But what we've tried to say is actually shake up and use different types of thinking space depending on how you feel at the time. And you've got a lot more control over that than you think. So I do a lot of work with students who get information overload, analysis paralysis, they get overwhelmed. Tables can be really helpful. And we might combine a table with a code or something that can help them, capture their writing. Color coding can be really powerful. So in a sense, you apply that exact same logic to your physical sense sort of environment around you. You apply that to the blank page in front of you. And again, it can be quite empowering, and that can really help us to overcome some barriers. And it's not, again, it's quite a sort of low risk, low resource approach. And just aligned to that, this is one of my favorite strategies, and I'll talk about a little bit about the book, one of the books in a moment where a lot of these strategies come from. But I use this myself all the time. But this is idea again of this universal challenge of us getting overwhelmed when we try and capture ideas on the page. So we came up with this idea of cake. And the thinking here is if you made a cake, you wouldn't bake the cake whilst stirring the ingredients together, whilst decorating the cake, whilst running out to the shop to buy some ingredients. You wouldn't do that all at the same time. The cake would be a mess. And yet that's exactly what we expect our brains to do. So when we're little and we're taught to write at school, we capture everything and we polish and refine and make our spelling beautiful, and we do it all at the same time. So it becomes sort of habitual or a learnt behaviour. And when students often get to higher education, the cognitive load or the size of the writing task means that method no longer works for a lot of people. So the wheels can fall off, and a lot of students can have a crisis or a panic about this. So the idea with cake, and you may be one of those people who just throughout life can do all this simultaneously. And if you can, I applaud you and say carry on doing it. But for a lot of the rest of us, cake just stands for this idea of just capture your ideas. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about what it looks like on a page or narrative. Just get those beautiful ideas and do not lose them. A is for arrange, and that's where you might build a narrative. And I might use this if I was writing a blog, putting my slides together, writing an essay, or doing an email even. Once I've got my ideas down, I'll just think, right, what's the route through here? How do I want to take the reader or audience with me? K is for keywords and transitions, and that's how we might get our readers or our audience to jump from one idea to the next, or one sentence to the next, or paragraph to the next. And then finally, that idea of editing and polishing. And that's where you do go back and you say, well, obviously you would make your cake look good, but you do that at the end. So actually for students, who struggle with capturing ideas on a page, for us on a, post-holiday or a Monday morning when we've got brain fog, using cake to write an email is a really, really empowering strategy. Okay, so I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to finish off now by just pulling this together. So I've tried to give you some practical strategies there in the second part. We've almost talked about this idea of looking at patterns beyond labels, going beyond that sort of individual shadow of a particular label or a diagnosis. As I say, we've looked at looking at patterns across your cohort and drawing on your knowledge. And then we've looked at the 3 R's to help us remove, reduce, and rethink those barriers. And remove and reduce help us to do that at the point of design or the point of delivery. And the onus there is, I would say, probably more placed on the teacher or the practitioner working in higher education. But the rethink takes us into a different space. And that's, in a sense, where I kind of want to finish off today. I'm not going to go hugely into this idea of well-being to well-doing. But this is one of the books that I've written with Sage. And in a sense, I feel like the cover is misleading, and in a way, perhaps the title is too. But we wanted to take this idea that we can all think about, tweak and adapt the way in which we work, the way in which we think, and the way in which we learn. And in doing so, that keeps us well. So well-being doesn't have to be a bolt on. It doesn't have to be you're stressed from your learning or you're from your work, but go and do a yoga class after work. Of course, we continue to do those things and they're really important, but it was this idea that we can shift a culture and we can do more in the classroom whilst we're teaching and learning. So this idea from well-being to well-doing was born. A lot of these strategies in the book were developed because I worked over a decade with these wonderful students who came up with really powerful creative approaches to overcoming barriers to learning. So essentially it's a manual for overcoming barriers to learning. But I thought just also to say, from the point of view of us kind of busy, people working in higher education, we're facing increasingly complex global challenges, diverse contexts, and we've got a lot on our plates. And naturally, we felt that this sort of approach enabled us to tackle multiple things simultaneously. So it becomes great for embedding accessibility, inclusivity, supporting, harnessing neurodivergence. It helps us to build resilience and autonomy in our learners. So it's a really highly adaptable, transferable approach. And I would urge you to explore that, as I say, with your students, but also in your own lives, so that it can help you to, work in a way that's more savvy, more efficient, saves us all much needed time and energy. So I think that's probably the point where I will pause. And just to say, we've got a few moments now. And again, Diane, I don't know if we've got any particular questions in the chat. What we did say is if we don't have the chance to get through all the questions, I'd be more than happy to, if people want to write some questions, I'm happy to answer those as well.
We have a few questions lined up. One in regards to a recent slide you had on thinking spaces. What is the washing line strategy?
No, that's a good one. Yeah. So for thinking spaces, the washing line is just the idea that sometimes it can be really helpful to break information down and move it around. Now, in primary schools, I think that the washing line is used quite commonly in some UK primary schools, but actually you could do that with post-it notes. And even when we wrote the books for Sage, actually, there were times where we just couldn't crack a paragraph, where we took different sentences, put them on different post-its and rearranged them. So it's that idea of giving yourself the ability to have that tangible sense of physically moving and sequencing information. So it can be quite powerful in that way. So yeah, good question.
Next question, how can we help students who have left university who have not honed their cognitive skills when they get into the working world?
I think that's so important. I've just been starting to try and reach out to some employers actually, because a lot of people, I'd include myself in that statement. I haven't got a diagnosis or a particular support need, but I struggled at uni and I didn't know half these strategies. So I think you're absolutely right. I think, not only do lots of students arrive at uni without knowing how they best learn, a lot of students leave uni also not knowing that. So I guess just encouraging that sense of lifelong learning, trying to build communities of learning, trying to break down those artificial distinctions between learning and living and working. We do that a lot in well-doing, where we'll say, every strategy in that book pretty much is transferable to your home life or your working life. So actually almost moving beyond this idea of having distinct phases in life, but we're just constantly learning, developing, and evolving as human beings. I think if there's the opportunity to work with employers as well, I think, embedding some of this stuff on placements could be really, really powerful. Or just, reaching out, as I say, to employers. We have in a sense, that potential in higher education, and lots of employers are really interested in graduate attributes. And more we will see neurodivergent students, as I say, filling some really important roles. And so actually getting employers to think differently is probably just as important as getting educators to think differently.
Yeah, and I think we have a few more questions, but as Abby said, if you leave your name associated with your question, Abby's happy to answer them after she gets back from her much needed break. But I think we have time for one or two more questions. Could we be missing a vital component by not explicitly addressing the emotional dimension in our learning environment model?
I think that's a really good point, the emotional learning. Yeah, I think that probably does come under the kind of cultural and the cognitive. And I guess in a sense, a lot of the work that I did actually, if I'm really honest, wasn't so much around a diagnosis that a student had got, but it was the emotional journey they'd been on to get to that point. So in a sense, doing this where you shift the emphasis from you've got a support need, you've got a problem, and you have to jump through hoops to get this support, saying this is just good stuff for everyone, really kind of shifts the narrative around that. And it was quite common that actually, once a student had found a strategy, they could reconceptualize some of the challenges that they'd experienced emotionally over the years. So good examples of that might have been a reader who, a student might say to me day one when they meet, oh, I'm a really weak reader. And within a year, you'd say, do you remember that question, that statement you made about yourself? And so in a sense, I think that you're absolutely, that's spot on. I think that's really important. And this comes with that honesty, this transparency about how we all learn, how our brains work, but that also draws on that kind of emotional resilience and the experiences we've been through. So I think a lot of learners can actually have answers themselves to some of the challenges, and it's our job to help them kind of unpack that and find practical strategies. It's a really good question.
And I think one last question here that I think is a good way to end is how can I best support my learners who are not diagnosed, awaiting diagnosis, or not aware that they may be neurodivergent?
Yeah, I'm almost at the point now where I've got to, and maybe this is a bit too radical, but I think there will always be a need to diagnose. And I think that's particularly important in schools, and students do access really important support, and we need to signpost. But I think what we're seeing more and more is recognition of inclusive teaching and learning design, and actually embedding this stuff at the start. And I think that's fundamental, because for every student that has a diagnosis, meets a threshold, accesses support, there'll be another 10 who haven't. And we all find ourselves at some point in our lives, we'll all struggle with our physical or mental health. And so it kind of, I think that's a nice way of putting it, actually, that embed this stuff. And actually you'll see the whole cohort benefit, and that then takes that pressure off and is really nice because actually it enables those students who might miss those vital lifelines. This stuff is good for all. Some of us might leave the call today and think, well, that's nice, but actually that doesn't work for me. Some of us will leave the call and think, my God, this stuff is fundamentally important. And I think that's what's important, where those students haven't accessed or been able to get a diagnosis quickly enough. They might not know that there's support out there in a way that they can build for themselves. And I think that's where things like Sage's skill set are really nice, actually, because it makes it much more accessible and you can direct students to that regardless. They don't need a diagnosis for that. And as I say, I recommend this stuff to everyone, and yeah, my family think of me as a walking, talking toolkit with tools for everyone in every context, I would say.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you everybody for joining us. Again, we will be sharing the webinar recording and Abby's slides with you all and all registrants in the coming days, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.